Since 2007, Wisconsin Eye has filmed countless hours of state capitol coverage to provide invaluable access to government actions, all available to watch live and on demand. Without Wisconsin Eye, Wisconsinites would lose an important source of transparent and unbiased accounts of public policy and politics. Give today to secure the longevity of balanced, unfiltered civic programming. You can do so at wisi.org/donate or text WISI to 44321.
So hello, everybody. Welcome to the WisPolitics-State Affairs Midwest Polling Summit on the rural voter. So it's rather presumptuous of us in Madison to observe the rural voter, but I think it's a good topic, and we have a live stream available to folks outstate, and we'll get them the video of this too. And so it's not just a Madison looking at the rest of the world kind of thing. I want to thank Wisconsin Eye for helping us on the live stream option, and I want to welcome those who are viewing elsewhere. So let's hear it for Wisconsin Eye. So here's a little commercial. If you don't know, we're part of the State Affairs Network. That goes from Massachusetts to California, 14 states, operations like ours, and building out new places along the way. I invite you to go to stateaffairs.com and check it out. And you can also go to WisPolitics.com for the site that you're used to. I want to thank our sponsors for this special event. We try to do this every year, and in Wisconsin, the Purple State, there seems to be a lot of topics to chew on. So I want to thank very much Michael Best Strategies, Spectrum, the Wisconsin Counties Association, Platform Communications, and ARP Wisconsin. And today we have ARP Wisconsin's new leader, Raj Shukla. So stand up and say hello, Raj. Thanks to our sponsors. Like I always say, we couldn't do it without you. Okay, so the format today, we're going to hear from two pollsters, and then we're going to have a panel discussion based on the slides that you've seen and questions from me and questions from you. We're going to leave ample time for questions from you, of course. So we're going to try to keep the presentations short, but if the pollsters allow, we'll distribute the polling slides to you via email in the next couple of days. So the first pollster who's going to present is Ryan Tyson of the Tyson Group based in Tallahassee, Florida. Thanks to Platform for Communications for helping to get Ryan here. They worked with Platform on some electioneering in Wisconsin, and including in the fall races and in the Supreme Court race. He has done a lot of work for conservative groups, including America PAC. He has a lot of Wisconsin ties. His family, he has family in Waupaca. Spent some time up there on a Waupaca area lake. So please welcome Ryan Tyson.
It's good to be here. Good morning, good morning still for a couple more minutes. This is a fun topic for me to talk about because I am this voter. You'll probably pick it up in my accent. I'm from a rural town west of Gainesville, Florida called Chiefland. Has anyone ever heard of Chiefland? See, there's a lot of that goes on in this state, too. No people in this state don't know any of your rural towns. I get how that works. So I jumped at the opportunity, not just because I wanted some curds and some spotted cow, but I also feel that not enough attention is paid to these voters, specifically as it relates to the era of Trump and why they're so important. So I'm going to start with a couple of slides. I'm going to stay on the national, more macro sense, and then the next presenter will get more into your state stuff. But I hope you enjoy this. First slide I want to show, you probably saw this one, or maybe you did not, because it's at the end of the slideshow. You probably saw this map on the internet a lot. And I love it when they show this map on the internet. The conservative influencers look at this and they go, America, It's all red. It's God's country. Trump country. And I'm like, all right, I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative, but let's just call balls and strikes here, guys. We win where there are no people. Or as I like to say back home, we win where there are hogs, logs, dogs, and frogs, right? And that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing. We don't have a universal national voter file in the United States, so the best thing we have to go on analysis is we have to kind of build it from the ground up. Great tools that help us do that now. But if you look at the exit polls from this last election, give or take 52% of the country self-ID'd as suburban, all right? Donald Trump won that vote 51-47, tight. This is nationally speaking. 29% of the country identifies as urban. We all know what urban is. This would be urban, what we're sitting in. Kamala Harris wins that 60-38, so she gets a 22-point margin. 19% of the country, nationally, would be classified, give or take, 19% as rural. Donald Trump wins it 64-34. 30 points. As you'll see here in a minute, the largest that I have this century, according to exit polling. And I think the reason why, as we start with this map, what I want to lean in on, is why this is so important. The Electoral College remains the thing that keeps us relevant. If the Electoral College ever got rid of, they'd campaign in 3 or 4 states in this country, and specifically probably 7 or 8 towns. Did you guys know that the Los Angeles media market's bigger than 43 states? They're not going to need to come to Wisconsin anymore. This state won't be relevant anymore if we were ever get rid of that. So I champion the Electoral College mainly because it's the way that my people still actually have a say, where I come from, right? Nationally speaking, when you're only 19%, I don't think there's evidence that you contribute to the popular vote. But if you look in the state of Georgia, Trump wins by 115,000 votes, 2%. State of North Carolina, Trump wins by 183,024, 3%. State of Pennsylvania, Trump wins by 120,000 votes, 2%. State of Michigan, he wins by 80,000 votes, 1.5%. We know here he won by just under 30,000, give or take some odd votes, just under a point. Nevada, 46,000, 1%. Arizona, 187,000. That one got out of hand, 5.5%. You think rural voters contribute to that? We'll show you why here in just a second. So the next slide, we're going to go through some time frames. I know you cannot see this from where you're sitting, so I'm going to try to walk through it. These are popular vote results this century. So this is the national popular vote. Let's start back in 2000, sort of set a narrative for why I think rural America, especially as the electorate, landed where we are today. We start in 2000. Bill Clinton's coming out of office. Arguably the best time in terms of fiscal discipline that this country has ever seen. The dot-com boom happened. People are getting rich all over the place. Silicon Valley becomes a thing. Debt was $5.6 trillion. $5.6 trillion. Isn't that a nice number? Gore wins the popular vote by 500,000 or 0.5. Bush takes the Electoral College. That was my first election. 534 vote margin in the great state of Florida. That was wild to witness that. Then we moved to 2004, post 9/11. I think what you'll see here when I juxtapose the rural numbers here in a second will show this, but we're waging a global war on terror. We had just launched into Iraq, and the Democrats nominate John Kerry. Couldn't have been more off of where the American people were at the time. Therefore, Bush takes the popular vote by 3 million, or 2.5%. Then you get to 2008. And I think the more we look at 2008 and 2012, we realize it was more about the candidacy of Obama, likely how 16, 20, and 24 was mostly about the candidacy of Donald Trump. 2008, rural voters saw bank bailouts. Rural voters saw a disproportionate share of war debt, and wars that people were having a hard time understanding why we were fighting came from rural America. Debt was 10 trillion at that point. We were the first time, I believe, in modern era that we did not cut domestic spending to pay for a war, right? 10 trillion in debt. Obama crushes, wins by almost 10 million votes, or 7.2%. Massive, massive win. Then you get to 2012, Tea Party was right in the middle. There was a real Republican nomination struggle. Obamacare is in effect, And then President Obama probably did politically one of the most astute things he did. He defines the caricature of Mitt Romney as this rich guy that's the source of all your economic anxiety out there. Private equity, binders full of women, all of that stuff. It worked very, very well. But you know what? My hypothesis is that it was in that effective political strategy that he planted the seed that would grow into the oak tree called Donald Trump. He created that ripe condition that would give Donald Trump the ability to rise up just 4 years later. We get to 2016, big shock. The populist blue-collar revolt goes into full effect. Democrats nominate Clinton, high negatives, we all know that. Debt's now $19 trillion. Clinton wins the popular vote by 2.8, but Trump takes the Electoral College. That's when you start seeing calls to get rid of the Electoral College. We don't need this anymore. Not a good public policy move, in my opinion. 2020, better or worse, it's all about Donald Trump and handling of COVID. Debt goes up to $27 trillion. Biden wins the popular vote by 7 million, or 4.5%. Then we get to 2024. We all know the story there. Let's all remember Donald Trump does a much better job running as an outsider than he does as an insider. In 2020, he's an insider. It's a referendum on how you're doing right now. Those other two elections, that was a lot easier path. He runs much better as one of those candidates from the outside, or insurgent candidate. Now we look at America's rule vote over that same time period. George W. Bush, according to the New York Times exit polls on every one of these, George W. Bush wins the rule vote by 22%. Makes sense. Aw shucks governor from Texas. He connects with people from the rural America. 2004, we're sending all of our boys to war. They had the president's back. I remember that convention in 2004. And rural America had his back, 20 points, just a little lower, but by 20 points. And then as I pointed out with Obama, you get to 2008, 8 points. McCain only won the rural vote by 8 points that year. Now, there was a little bit of that was turnout, but mostly Obama just connected with people. And by the way, if you want to do something funny, not that you have time to do this, but I'm a pollster, so I have to do this. Go watch videos of Barack Obama in 2008 and now. Holy smokes, two different people. Two totally different messages. 2012, remember what I said, the caricature of Mitt Romney? He's the reason you have all these problems with economic anxiety. Politically speaking, it was a brilliant strategy. He only wins by 14. He sees a little bit of an uptick. Why is that happening? I think it was because the culture stuff wasn't working so well. They didn't really like the leftward-leaning nature of what was happening, but those margins are nothing like Bush margins, as you can see. And then, as I said earlier, we get to 2016. Donald Trump wins rural America by 28 points. Blue-collar revolts in full effect. 2020, Joe Biden wins, and as you see that correlation? He only wins rural America. Trump only wins by 15 points, very similar to what Romney had in 2012. And then in 2024, we see the biggest margin that we have record for, 30-point win by Donald Trump. I think we all know why it was that happened. Final slide that I'll say on this intro. Moving forward, I would offer, since 1994, give or take, NAFTA, rural America's been about economics. We're getting hurt. Jobs, poverty, drugs, meth, all kinds of bad things. Donald Trump's been a political figure that rural America feels gets them. But economic anxiety is the foundation of where I see these voters going. And the warning I have for my party is I'll never forget polling the 2016 election. First state in the primary calendar is New Hampshire that allows people to vote however it is they want. And I remember thinking it was an error when I would see Donald Trump voters on first choice, but then Bernie Sanders on second. And then I would see Bernie Sanders voters on first choice picking Donald Trump on second. And now all these years later, I'm sitting here watching a documentary the other night where Bernie Sanders, in all places, is in rural West Virginia, talking to those voters about economic anxiety they're going through. A county Donald Trump won by 40 points. That is what the foundation of what's going to drive the future of American politics in rural America is. It's economic anxiety. And I put all those trillions of dollars in there because I truly do feel that our people feel that pain of this insane inflation and the astronomical dollars that we're printing, crushing the American dollar or whatever it is we're about to do to it. We feel it in rural America more. I really believe that. Our education opportunities aren't as good. There's a reason, there's socioeconomic reasons why our kids go to the military far more than anywhere else. And then I'll leave you with a data point. I did a national sample over the summer. We asked the question how confident you are in covering a $400 emergency. Do you have the cash on hand in case you have a $400 emergency? Overall, nationally, 37% said, I do not have $400 in case I have an emergency. But in rural America, 44%. Proves my point. I appreciate it.
All right, let's hear it for Ryan Tyson again, everybody. That was great. And he's an event producer's dream. He stuck to his 10 minutes. Thank you. Wow. Charles, the pressure is going to be on. Anyway, our next pollster is a familiar face to you all and a good friend, the poll director of the nonpartisan Marquette University Law School poll, Charles Franklin, everybody.
Okay, the technology works. It's impressive. I'm not going to say anything, Jeff, but yeah. So thanks. This is a great start. Couple of things. Well, hang on. This. Now, I grew up on a 210-acre farm outside of a town of 3,000 people. I spent 17 years there, and I've spent the rest of my time in urban areas and in universities, but I still have a little recollection of those days baling hay. We were talking about that the other day. And yeah, it's damned hard work, but also one of the great memories of growing up. But I don't pretend to be in touch with the modern farmer, so I'm going to leave that for Brian to handle. Some of the things you know already about Wisconsin, I'm not going to show you a slide of, but I'm sure you can picture it. And that's the shift of our more rural parts of the state in a Republican direction over the last 20 years. You can pick almost any interval you like, but it's really nice to pick 2004 and 2020 or 2024. Either one works just as well. And what we used to see then were blue cities, red suburbs, and the western and northern part of the state was actually a pretty pastel color. Light blues and light reds with some mix in there. You'll remember David Obey in the 7th Congressional District from 1969 until 2010. That is a deeply red district, and that doesn't have anything to do with redistricting. It's the shift in voters. And so what we've seen over this period is a significant reddening of rural areas of the state, even if the cities, the small cities, larger villages in those areas have actually gotten a little bit bluer. So we'll come to that at the end of the talk, but it's not just a homogeneous movement in a red direction. There's some divisions within our rural parts of the state as well. Where is rural Wisconsin? Now, we were joking about this earlier. There are at least 20 different definitions of rural. This is the one that we use a lot, not the only one that we use a lot. The green is what we classify as rural areas. These are zip codes, is why you don't recognize any of the shapes rather than counties. That darkest purple are urban areas. The lighter purple is close-in suburbs, and the very light purple, you can really quibble about whether to classify those as suburban or exurban, but these are defined by commuting patterns. Where do you live, but also where do you make your livelihood? And in anything that's purple, people are living somewhere, but substantial numbers are commuting in and working in whether it's a large village or a city. They're not making their living, their jobs are not located where they live. But the green parts of the state are overwhelmingly places where people live and work, and they may commute to, a town nearby for some of their jobs, but they don't commute to Eau Claire, for example, or they don't commute into Wausau. So you can just see from the map, not unlike the map of the vote, you look at all that red on the national map and you say, holy cow, this is a great red country. You look at this and you say, holy cow, we're overwhelmingly rural. Well, not quite when you count people. I think it's going to be below the table, so I'm going to read it to you. The rural areas in the state, that green on the map, makes up 52.9% of the square miles in the state. More than half of the state is classified as rural by this definition. But that's only 13.7% of the people. Conversely, urban core areas make up 7% of the area, but 56% of the population. So in there you see the urban-rural divide as one of greatly unequal strength, where land area doesn't vote, people vote, and the urban areas are where most people vote. And urban here includes places like La Crosse and Eau Claire. It's not just Milwaukee or Madison. But that's a real difference. Now, you might want to be a little more generous than our definition here. I think you could certainly argue that the small town commute areas, which is 5.7% of people, is pretty rural. And you might even quibble about the small city commuters at 14% as being rural. What we find when we ask people, would you describe where you live as urban, suburban, or rural? We get about 30%, 34% that describe where they live as rural. And I just let you do the thought experiment. Go to Waukesha, but then just drive west in Waukesha County. I think you could mistake that for farmland pretty quickly once you get just a few miles out of the city of Waukesha. And that's true of most places. You don't have to go very far south of Madison or far north of Madison to see fields as far as you can see. So we really are more mixed. That's why we use zip codes, actually, because they're more compact than counties. Almost every county in the state has a mix of some more built-up areas, whether they're full-blown cities or large villages, and lots of rolling farmland outside of those areas. So it's not a simple matter to call a place urban or rural, and it's certainly not a simple matter to think of a county as purely urban or purely rural. I want to talk a bit about the differences between them, and some of this is hardly surprising. In fact, very little is very surprising here. If you look at the urban core, the party balance is minus 14, meaning 14% more people who call themselves Democrats than call themselves Republicans. In every other area of the state, there's a net Republican advantage, and that's 20 points in rural areas. Again, that green area of the map. But it's actually 18% in the suburban areas, so there's not a unique advantage for Republicans in the rural parts of the state compared to suburban or even the small cities. This is the big bulk of the area of the state, but the small percentage of the population that lean pretty solidly Republican and have gotten more so over the years. I'm going to skip, on the interest of time, ideology, but it lines up exactly how you think it would as well. Maybe a little bit more of a conservative advantage in the rural areas than you saw a partisan advantage there. Though I will point out the percent of moderates is about a third in every region of the state. So be careful about characterizing these as only one thing. Favorability towards Donald Trump follows partisanship, but it doesn't follow it nearly as sharply as partisanship and ideology does. Now, I wanted to touch a little bit on rural life rather than just talk about the politics. So what about church attendance? This one's close to me because the church was an incredibly important part of my life in those first 17 years on the farm. And I know it's a huge part of many people's rural experience in the country or in the state as well. But it's a surprisingly small difference in church attendance. The rural areas are as less attend less, just as the other parts do. Now, you know, the urban areas, yeah, it's a little smaller. 39% say they go to church or religious services at least once or twice a month, and many go weekly or more than weekly. 39%, but that only goes up to 45% in rural areas. So one image you might have of, you know, the rural church that people come in from the farm to go to, or the small village where the church is a big thing on Sundays, it's still part of that life. But look at the far right. In the rural areas, 37% say they hardly ever attend religious services. So that's maybe different from what the stereotype might suggest. But this one we can rely on. Do you hunt deer? Urban areas, only 30% hunt, 60% in rural areas hunt. A tradition of Wisconsin, but one that is more concentrated in the rural part of the state. The idea that, you know, folks from Janesville or Madison or Milwaukee are loading up their guns and heading for the woods is much less true than maybe it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. What is a farmer? This actually turns out to be a little hard to define because, you know, you think of you own the land, you farm that land, but maybe it's, you know, 4,000 herd commercial farm. Maybe it's, you know, 80, well, not 80, but 80 head of cattle that you're milking on a small operation. But we just asked people in the survey, do you own or work on a farm? Okay, so that includes owners and non-owners who work there. By that measure, we get about 18% who say they themselves are farmers. But then we also ask a broader question, do you, your immediate family, or your parents own or work on a farm? I think of that as connected to a farm in the way that I have no manure on my shoes anymore. But I still feel connected in a way from personal history and family. If you do that, it's 32% of rural areas that have that direct farm connection through their families. So don't think of the movement into the villages and away from the farms, the sale of the farms. My family went through 210 acres, and you know, then we sold the cows, and then we sold most of the land, and then we sold a little bit more of the land, and finally, of course, we sold the rest of it. That's certainly a life in the farm in the rural areas today. But I wanted to close with this. Don't think of places as purely homogeneous, even in counties you think of as rural. So we're going to take a little tour on the sort of western side of the state from the southern border to the north. So Lafayette County, look at how red the county is. Look at how blue each of the built-up villages, technically villages, are. Look at Vernon County, which is one of my favorites for this incredible diversity there. Barron County, we're getting into the deep red parts of the state. But what do you notice? Every built-up area is a little less red than the surrounding area. So this is that gap. Barron, you would certainly call a rural county. You would certainly call it a heavily Republican county. But it doesn't mean the whole place is perfectly homogeneous. Bayfield, this one's probably less of a surprise, but if you look at just the county map, Bayfield will remain one of those northern rural counties that's reliably blue. But you see how divided even that county is geographically. And finally, I just wanted one more deep red county, Pierce County, more in the center north of the state. Here, the urban areas also, or the villages, are a little lighter, but they're still very, very red. So the takeaway from all of this is don't think of the rural parts of the state as completely homogeneous. Even though we have seen big movements in the margins of the vote, there is still this diversity within every county in the state. I've Can show you all 72 maps on another occasion. And it's just striking how you see this pattern repeated over and over again of polarization, if you want to call it that, within counties, not just between rural counties and urban counties. It's within places as well. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay,
Let me go to my corner.
okay, panelists, come on up, and we're going to start our panel discussion.
I couldn't resist.
So, Charles, I was reminded when you were talking about the deer hunting slide there, I think that Mark Green, when he ran for governor, and he was talking about the Green Bay media market, he said that was the land of the Catholic deer hunter. So, I think he got that right.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody, I'm going to introduce the panel. You know the two pollsters, of course. And then to Charles's left is former state representative Katrina Shankland, Democrat from Stevens Point, now executive director of Rust Belt Rising, and she was a candidate in the 3rd Congressional District last time around. Katrina, why don't you just tell us what your organization is about at this point?
Sure, absolutely. So Rust Belt Rising is an organization that operates in 6 Midwest states: Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. We were founded after the 2016 election when Democrats got together and said, okay, what blue wall in the Midwest? Let's regroup and ensure that Democrats truly are the party of working people by showing, not telling. And so we train candidates of all levels, state, federal, and local, to focus on economic issues, including kitchen table pocketbook issues that frankly aren't always focused on anymore, right? And we offer these trainings for free across our 6 states. Glad to be here.
Okay, now, so Katrina and Ryan, you'll be sharing that mic. Make sure you lean into the mics, eat the mics. Okay, so at the end of the table here is a good friend, Brian Reisinger. He's an executive with Platform Communications, and he's hails from Sauk County Dairy Farm, and he's author of Land Rich, Cash Poor. And I have to highly recommend that book, folks. If you haven't read it, it's both personal memoir and a look into how the farm economy has ebbed and flowed and crashed over the years through the eyes of he and his family. So let's welcome the panelists. Okay, so let's just start with this question. And I think, Charles, you were getting to some of this, so let's just start with you. What's the biggest misconception we have of the rural voter? Because, like you said, there are some stereotypes out there. I think the church-going one is definitely one of them, and you already blew that one up. What other misconceptions are there?
I think the biggest one are those maps that I showed you at the end, that you can think of the rural parts of the state as homogeneous, and they're just not. And remember, those two are confusing land area with people, because there are a lot of people that live, relatively speaking, in those smaller cities, smaller towns, in rural counties. So it means that life is not just all of one cloth. The farmsteads that still exist throughout these rural areas are unique in their own economic situations, the kind of people that work on them, but there's really a lot of heterogeneity in the area. And those things about religion and others show that there are some things where the cultural differences are really very, very clear, and hunting is just a proxy for thinking about that. But there are others that you might imagine are big differences, like religion, that don't seem to be as big of an issue or big of a divide as we see. I also agree with the point about economic anxiety, though. Our polling constantly shows worries about inflation, number one, the economy, number two. Everything else falls way short of those two. And that really doesn't matter as much whether you're in an urban or a rural area. That concern is high right now for everybody.
Okay, so Katrina.
Sure. I think probably what many of us have heard is that they're monolithic. And just like Charles Franklin said, there is not that level of homogeneity, especially as it relates to individuals' policy positions. I hear so many stereotypes about, a rural voter and what they stand for. And I would say, especially when I've been out knocking doors in my previous district, but also many other competitive districts in the state, you will frequently hear repeatedly from different rural voters, I vote for the person, not the party. And I am going to, whoever's selling me the best things that are good for me is what I'm going to go for. So there's less of that rigid adherence to ideology that I think is often, especially in the national media, depicted as almost a fervor of our culture wars. And I would argue that when, regardless of party, you have candidates that are truly focusing on fulfilling the local needs and local issues of community members, they are extremely amenable to voting across the ticket, a Tammy Baldwin Scott Walker voter, for example, or an Obama Ron Johnson voter. And I think that is something that a decade ago, when I said these words, people from my own party who lived in Madison and Milwaukee would not believe me. They said there was no such thing as those voters. And now I think there's a fundamental recognition that is true, and that lack of understanding of these are not single issue voters, they're not monolithic voters, they are going to have very different viewpoints on a number of issues, just like every voter, right? They're individual people, so we need to respect that.
Okay, Ryan Tyson.
What was the question again?
What's the biggest misconception we have of the rural voter?
Well, I think a lot of good stuff's been said. I'll just speak, if I can, from the rural South perspective.
Yeah.
And I think the misconception is we're all racist. That's not true. I'm just being blunt. I think, some of the greatest people in the world live in rural areas, and there's just all these awful misconceptions about people. So that'd be one that I would offer from at least a Southern perspective.
Okay. Brian.
I think the biggest one, it encompasses, and I agree with a number of the things that have been said, but this one kind of encompasses all of them, I think.
Yeah, lean into that mic, man.
I think the misconception that I think is biggest is that rural voters are all pissed off. Pisses me off, to be honest with you. There's frustration, but it goes back to economic anxiety and other types of frustrations. But you're not going home to Sauk County and people are screaming at you when you get across the Dane County border. Sometimes it's the other way around. So.
Okay, so expand on that a little bit. What are people? They're frustrated but not pissed off. So what are they frustrated about?
Mainly, I think there's a lot, but it goes back to things that you heard from Ryan and Charles both, which is the economic angst that exists, and we'll probably talk about that a lot. But we've got an economic status quo that has left the rural voter behind, and it's not only the Rust Belt jobs, it's true. It's the Rust Belt jobs and it's NAFTA. But it goes back 100 years because it began with the disappearance of our farms, 45,000 a year for the past century. We began losing the farms that built the small towns. They began losing population. My home county of Sauk County lost everybody age 20 to 24. Decade after decade, that was a net loss for 7 decades. Lost all their young people. So by the time we have the Rust Belt jobs disappearing, you've had a farm economy and small towns that have been getting wiped out. So we've got 100 years of economic status quo that people feel left behind.
I want to, if I can, speak to that for a second. I'm glad you brought that up because one of the misconceptions I see is there's so many people who live in urban areas, suburban areas, they think groceries come from the grocery store. They don't. I'm being serious. I mean, there's so little appreciation for that reality of our farms and ranches in this country. And I heard something really interesting once in a focus group. There was a guy that worked on a farm, and he said something like only a voter like that could say. He goes, y'all think it's bad relying on foreign oil? Wait till we're relying on foreign food. So I'm glad you brought that up because it's these situations that so many of these rural farmers and ranchers are being put into of selling their land because developers want it or whatever, and it's like, what are we doing? So that's a good point.
Okay, because I'm kind of now struck by, that's like a little history lesson through your personal farm experience, Brian. So this slide, if you will, in the rural economy it didn't happen this decade. It's been happening for decades.
Yeah.
So, which is setting up, I can't easily go to Ryan's slide there, but about over the presidential margins in rural areas. I mean, so I guess how much of the, if we're going to concentrate on economic anxiety here, how much of the slide in the farm economy is responsible for the change in the politics?
It's
Katrina,
huge.
go ahead, Brian.
It's big, and it's in a lot of unseen ways. One is, first of all, when you're wiping out farms like we have been, it increases the cost of food. So actually everybody who was ticked off about the price of food and costs after COVID, it ties back to that. But to get more specifically on point, we have a world where we've been losing farms for a century, towns have been shrinking, and then manufacturing jobs have layered on top of that. And it goes so deep that it fuels the kinds of things you hear Katrina talking about. So we've got people who voted for, now my county is the only county in the state that's done this, I think 5 times in a row. Sauk County was a, how'd it go? Obama voter, Trump voter, Biden voter, Trump voter.
Bellwether.
Only county in the state that's done that. I'm biased, but it's also the numbers. And the reason is because my county, but also rural areas in general, are driven by that economic angst. As Ryan said, Obama was speaking to that. Trump spoke to that. Biden didn't connect with it quite as much, but it was sort of like COVID kind of flipped the script on that, and it was also kind of an economic thing. And so that's what drives this decade after decade, is that frustration, that feeling of who's taking on this economic status quo for me.
So you don't want a data center there? Is that not the answer?
It could be a tiny part of the answer, right?
Well, but it's hard, right? Because rural areas both need investment in places coming in, and they need, to be able to have useful economic, output from the land and the resources that they have. And so it's a big dilemma.
Mm-hmm. I would add, in addition to the loss of farms and the corporate consolidation into larger farms, right? Your small 50-head cattle farms are gone essentially in Wisconsin for the most part, not for lack of people wanting to do it, right? But in addition, there are other trends that we've seen over the last decade especially that have really, I think, sped up when it comes to corporate consolidation, and I would argue even within, long-term care and assisted living, you're seeing fewer and fewer county-owned nursing homes. There's a battle, thinking about Sauk County, there's a battle right now in Sauk County, Portage County, and Lincoln County as to whether or not counties can afford or continue to keep their skilled nursing homes publicly owned versus private. And I think we're also seeing that not only within healthcare, but health insurance and pharmaceuticals, name an industry, tech, financial services, right? And I think who suffers the most when you see lack of consumer choice? Rural communities that only have a few institutions, which are actually mostly public or publicly centered, whether it's hospitals, public schools, maybe a 2-year campus if there's one left, or a 4-year campus. I think of former Senator Dale Schultz, who used to talk about his district in very rural Wisconsin as what are the major employers in every town, village, and small city you drive through? They are almost always education and healthcare. So in addition to agriculture, which is probably one of the largest private sector employers within rural communities, of course, we're seeing those same trends within healthcare access, healthcare and insurance coverage, and then the ability for kids to go to school and be bused to school in their own neighborhood and community versus an hour away, and then add and compound to that, that access to that 2- and 4-year campus, whether it's technical or a University of Wisconsin school. So I think there's a lot of economic anxiety, not only related to our proud agricultural heritage, but also to your access to nice things. I was at a forum last year where Senator Dale Schultz stood up and said, "We want nice things too." And I've said it over and over and over, and I'm going to continue to say it, rural people deserve the best just like everyone else, and I think that's a core component of where this economic anxiety came from, and Trump in 2016 really understood it and capitalized on it, and I think, there's a greater awareness of it now.
So, Charles, part of this is I personally say, well, this is about Trump, that Trump changed things dramatically, even though this may have been happening. So how much of it has to do with Trump, or how much of it has to do with all the things leading up to Trump?
Yeah, I don't give it all to Trump. I think if you look at the divide, Craig Gilbert was chatting with me yesterday about looking at the divide between the places in the state that we call cities, that are legally defined as cities, and the places that are towns. Now, town can mean a pretty built-up area, but mostly towns are these rural squares throughout the county. So credit to Craig, and he can disavow it later if he wants to. But the divide between the towns and the cities has been growing over at least the last 20 years or 30 years. It's not like this was something that didn't exist before. On the other hand, some of the balance has changed. I'd go back to Obie in the 7th District, which, was not the bluest district in the state, but it was reliably blue. And up to 2008, you could look at that district in close detail and find that there were blue parts of the district all over. There wasn't really a clear Republican stronghold that you could think of a Republican candidate winning the House seat based on past voting. But that changed with the Tea Party revolution in 2010, and now it's been reliably red. So I think a good bit of this predates Donald Trump, but Trump certainly reinforces it. Despite some of the economic fallout of some of the tariff policies in the first term, which landed heavily on farm areas as well, though also with a bailout afterwards. Okay,
so I want to ask you something about your slides when you were showing the independent and the Republican, the party ID. So independents tend to lean Republican.
In rural areas, they do. The slides I showed you include people who say I'm independent, but I tend to vote Republican. But I think even among the pure independents, the more you move into rural areas, the more the balance of those folks end up voting Republican in the election. In fact, I don't want you to bring up the slide, but the margin between people who call themselves Republicans and call themselves Democrats in rural areas is not as large as the vote margin that we've seen in some recent presidential elections especially. So the voting is a little more partisan than the party identification is. I want to say one more thing, though, and that is on the national level, the relationship between population density in a county, which is another way of measuring urban-rural, is quite strong. And in Wisconsin it's quite strong, but in Wisconsin our rural places are still voting a little less Republican than the country as a whole would vote. So given our demographics of rural areas, we are a little more or a little less Republican than, say, a comparable county in Indiana might be or a comparable county in Iowa might be.
Okay, so just I guess a footnote on the 2024 election. I think going in, a lot of people thought Trump and Republicans had fully exploited the Republican vote in rural counties in Wisconsin. Yet they surpassed their previous margins. Now, is that because of organization, or is that because of Trump as the outsider, as Ryan pointed out? Let's observe on that a little bit. Go ahead.
I credit Joe Biden for a lot of that. I think a failed presidency gives a real boost to the out party. And I'm not trying to take anything away from Donald Trump or other economic forces, but I do think a little too little credit is given to how people feel about the incumbent administration. And in 2004, that was a real burden for Democrats everywhere.
I don't disagree with that, but I think that what you mentioned about economics is important. Inflation, I think, drove a ton of this. And in Wisconsin, we had every single traditional rural county had Trump and the GOP improving their margin over 2020 and 2016. Every single one. When I say traditional, I mean other than Door County, being a tourism destination, and its mix is different. But every kind of conventional rural county increased the percentage vote for Trump in 2024 over prior elections, even though, number one, it was supposed to have been maxed out, as you said, Jeff, and number two, even though the Democrats made the biggest push in a generation in rural Wisconsin. They visited Wisconsin over 20 times compared to Hillary Clinton's 0, and they were actually in places like where I'm from in southwest Wisconsin, which is kind of mind-blowing. So for that vote to yield even more for the Republicans and the GOP, there has to be a lot of things happening, and the economic impact of the increased cost of living, which goes back to Ryan's point about how this has been happening historically, it was kind of like that cake had been baked in there, and then there was a whole bunch of frosting put on that by the Biden administration in the last couple of years.
I would add to that, when you're analyzing, the maxed out votes from Republicans, you also have to look at where Democrats lost votes, and some of it was turnout in urban cities, right? Yes. And so I think the discussion, especially when we talk 2016 on, not just fall elections, but spring elections, you have to be looking really closely at the total vote numbers and how many people are turning out for each party. Now, if you don't believe me, ask Republicans how they feel about spring elections right now. They don't have a great track record in Wisconsin, and it's because Democrats have been beating them at the turnout game in spring elections, whereas when Trump is on the ballot, that's where they can really maximize. I would say, the closest that Democrats have to that is the Obama coalition, which we have since not replicated, right? So I think that is a very important piece of this, because there was one analysis after the 2024 election that said, well, Kamala Harris only needed 3% more rural voters, but the other component of that is she wasn't getting the voters in places like Philadelphia and Milwaukee to win Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And so it's a component of, turnout going up for each party, turning out your folks while also persuading. And I think if there's one thing I learned from the 2024 election, it's you have to do both at all times, and neither party is good at both at all times.
Okay, so Ryan, I'm going to ask you a specific question from a national point of view. How much of, we're Wisconsin-centric here. Here we are in Madison, Wisconsin, talking a lot about Wisconsin. But how many of the lessons here are translating to other upper Midwest states or Pennsylvania or...
I think they absolutely translate.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the only difference is when you start talking about we're just looking at swing states for a second. Obviously, Hispanics are a presence that's in Arizona that doesn't exist up here. They don't have African American voters down there. You do have them here. You have them in Michigan. You have them in Pennsylvania. Nevada's sort of its own thing. Georgia and North Carolina are the New South in many ways. So, but I think as we're talking about the rural voters, the lessons, everything that Brian said is happening in all of the entire country. It's not unique to Wisconsin. It's just happening with the different kind of ag, opportunities that we have. I mean, Florida has the best citrus industry it used to be in the world. Our citrus industry is dying, and it's awful. So it's not limited to dairy cows and dairy farms. It's ranchers. It's everything else as well. Can I make a comment on the last question that was just made? I think everything everybody said up here was right. And one of the things that I always go back to was when I saw Kamala Harris answer that question on The View of anything you would do differently than the president, and she said, can't think of anything. I think that's what really helped, because y'all are 100% right. I mean, you cannot give Trump full credit for 16 and 24, because Hillary helped him in 16 and Kamala helped him in 24. So, but those are very good points. That's how I'd answer that.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Brian first with this question, because this was your idea for a question. So are both parties taking the rural voter for granted? Are they in danger of taking the rural voter for granted?
Both are in danger, and I think it depends upon candidate to candidate a little bit whether people are. But I think that with all due respect to the Democrats in the room, I think they have for a while struggled with how to connect, and part of it is I think that, an urban party has begun to think that people are just ticked off, and that's it, and that goes back to some of the misconception stuff. Republicans have done a good job of connecting, but we have to have policy solutions from the Republican Party that are going to have a long-term impact. And that's doable, but it's a challenge. And so it's kind of like the issue, honestly, that Democrats face in inner cities, where there's a little bit of an argument that Trump and the Republicans are making going in inner cities, saying, what has the Democrats done for the last 40 years? I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that Republicans have to be careful that that doesn't happen in rural America too. And it's not that all of a sudden the vote is going to swing back the other way, right? The plates have been shifting this way tectonically for a while. But we have to remember that for Republicans, they've got to keep in mind that Obama was winning or was competitive in many of these counties just a decade ago.
Okay, Katrina, I think you need to weigh in on this one.
Yeah, so the corollary to that is I think Democrats, I've seen way too many candidates, and I'm sure I'm guilty of this too, think, okay, it's self-evident that if I provide good policy solutions, people will just jump on board. And that's not true. You have to connect first, and you need to understand the culture of your community and the communities you're running in, as well as understand that that culture drives the politics, which then drives the policy. And so, you might think that your top 5 issues should be something that every Wisconsinite agrees with, and you might have 25 pollsters across the country that can confirm those results. That doesn't mean that when you're knocking doors, you're not hearing about the extremely local issues, including things like potholes or a local employer going out of business, that actually surmount all of those issues, and being able to connect with those folks is really important. So Brian mentioned, Republicans are good at, connecting culturally, and, the results are inherent there. But I think Democrats sometimes view rural voters as, okay, like, we're going to make a play for you with this set of policies. If we give you broadband and agriculture reform and access, then you should vote for us. That's not true. Voters, in many cases, don't have the luxury of voting on a number of policy issues. They're literally voting over whether or not a party is going to give them either the tax break or the child's care or the health care that they need, and that depends on the person who's going into those communities. So I appreciated the caution from Ryan about Bernie Sanders going to West Virginia. There's a reason, right? If you don't play in these rural communities, if you don't show up, why in the world would we ever listen to you? And I think that's true. Chuck Schumer is pretty famous for saying in 2016 that for every battleground blue-collar worker that they would lose in deindustrialized Western Pennsylvania, they could pick up 2 suburbanites outside Philadelphia. Well, how is that strategy working now, right? And we have to invest. And so there's organizations like mine, Rust Belt Rising, but also Contest Every Race and the Rural Urban Bridge Initiative that are pushing really hard for going beyond resistance. That's all we hear about these days, and actually focusing on investment and organizing in rural communities. And so Ruby is actually advocating for the DNC in the next cycle to spend 10% of their budget on rural communities and rural candidates. And I think that lack of investment over the last, I'm going to say decade plus, but it's much longer than that, has really predicated the trends that we've seen, in addition to the economic trends that have driven some of these voting patterns.
Okay, so before we move to 2026, I just want to say to the virtual audience and to the audience here, if you're going to be shy about asking a question, you can always email me at mayors@WisPolitics.com, and I'll try to get the question in. Mayors, M-A-Y-E-R-S, @WisPolitics.com. And don't put me on your spam list. Okay. All right, now, 2026. Charles, you mentioned the T word, tariffs. Okay, so how is the tariff policy? It's affecting a lot of farmers in Wisconsin right now. We had a program on this last week that focused on tariffs, and the pain in the farm economy is being felt. Is it affecting the leanings of the rural voter? Will it affect the leanings of the rural voter?
We consistently see this as the weakest political issue for Trump and more broadly Republicans right now. I already mentioned that inflation is the number one most important problem, but when we ask, will tariffs help or hurt the economy, only 25% think that will help, pushing over 60% hurt, and some people say won't have much of an effect. And will Trump's policies lower inflation or increase inflation? Over 60% say increase inflation. Even among Republicans, there is a majority, about 54% say Trump's policies will decrease inflation, but that's still more of a 50-50 split even within the party, even if it's still a lot better performance than among independents who are very negative about the economic side, both on tariffs and inflation and the economy. So I think this is a big issue, but I don't think it's unique at all to the rural areas. The question is, how do you exploit that? And the other question, because I'm not an economist and I am not doing economic forecasts for the fall of 2026, if the economy has shown relative stability between now and then, maybe those issues will be weaker. We've seen just a small increase in inflation and a small increase in unemployment over the last 6 months. It doesn't look to me like a dramatic change that's about to hit, but I don't pretend to have the crystal ball for where we look literally a year from now. Decent times, stable times, I think that would really help Republicans in all of the elections across the country. But I think an appreciable increase in inflation really could be ironically, the same dagger that struck Joe Biden could be striking the Trump administration.
Okay, Ryan, what are you seeing in your polling data and your focus groups?
On the last thing that Charles just said, one of the worst tactical mistakes, maybe it's strategic as well, that the Biden team did before he got out was they were running around the country saying Bidenomics was working. That demonstrated severe disconnect with the voter. I hope I think you're seeing the same thing I'm seeing in my data. It would be very unwise to run out there and say everything's great. That would be tantamount to, Bidenomics is working, so they've got to be very careful on that. I think Karl Rove wrote a piece in the Journal about that recently. Here's, as it relates to 26, and I hope I'm answering your question, party out of power are the Democrats. Anytime the loyal opposition's out of party, you start to see the primary process work itself out. That process of how the primaries will work out, that's the best thing going for Republicans right now. It absolutely is. Because the kind of cast of characters, I don't mean that as a pejorative, but the kind of cast of characters on the left these days that are involved in politics and are running, they're going further and further left. I was mentioning to somebody earlier, I just got an email about there's going to be a Democrat primary to take on a U.S. Senator in Florida. It'll be 3 females, a Republican incumbent, and then there'll be an AFM female, and there'll be a white female. That battle, because the African-American female is a very young, not progressive, whatever's further left than that, I'll let you pick the word. That debate is the best thing that can happen for Ashley Moody. And I think you're seeing, like, in my opinion, our party, yes, we've got all these challenges with all these economics, but that process of letting the left work out their bases and let the bases figure out who it is they want to be supportive of, and most importantly, the issues that drive those voters, that's the best thing that our party has going for us. And I'll leave it with one data point. I mentioned this to this group earlier. I did a general election survey the other day, and on the issue grid, I put defeating Donald Trump or serving as a check and balance on Donald Trump. It was the #1 issue for the Democrats in that sample. Wasn't the economy, wasn't anything. One was pushing back on Donald Trump. So if that whole process is focused on Trump derangement syndrome or whatever you want to call it, that's probably the best thing that could happen for Republicans.
So Democrats are your best friend, is what you're saying?
I think so. I do.
All right. So, Katrina, do you see the economic effects having a big impact positively for Democrats next year?
Well, I don't want to say that it's positive. I would never want to capitalize politically on a failure economically for voters, right? Just to put that out there. But I think we've learned something from 5 years ago when we had retaliatory tariffs. And while there was an aid package to mitigate some of the harm, I would point out and caution that I don't think it's going to go the same way for Republicans this time. I think farmers were willing, of course, to give the benefit of the doubt because, the USDA tried to make them whole when it came to the losses they took with the first round of retaliatory tariffs. But they're losing market access. Ask a soybean farmer in Iowa or western Wisconsin how they feel right now. Because China this quarter has bought 0 from the United States. And where are they going? Brazil and Argentina. And who just proposed a $20 billion aid package to Argentina? Because of their economic failures? Donald America First Trump. So if I'm a Democratic candidate running for Congress, or even on the state level, I would tour not just soybean farms, I would be going everywhere with this message. This man said he was going to end the wars, he was going to stop putting money into foreign countries, and he was going to put you first, but all I see is the opposite right now, because he's actually taking our tax money, giving it to a foreign country that's eating our lunch when it comes to farmers' market access. And talk to a farmer about their input costs and what happens when they temporarily, for even 1 quarter, lose market access. That's the difference between them going under, shutting down, or being able to feed their family and be able to pay their workers. So it's very serious. And I say that because I haven't seen every Democratic candidate running for office have that message yet, but I do think we need to do some work when it comes to organizing in rural communities, and especially talking to farmers, asking them about their input costs. Where does potash come from? Canada. How are tariffs affecting farmers' fertilizer costs, one of their biggest costs? So having candidates go through that, and this is something that we're doing, and Rust Belt Rising is helping candidates think through strategies to, not that we want to capitalize on economic failure, but to show that there's a better way. And so I mentioned before, we have to go just beyond resistance. I agree with you, Ryan, that if Democrats' number one message is that they're not Trump, that isn't the best message. The best message to people who might have voted for Trump 1, 2, or 3 times is, hey, it's not working. We're going to make sure it works. No government should ever use any farmer as a cudgel for a retaliatory tariff war. Come on. So that would be my advice to Democratic candidates.
That's a good message, right? That's an example of a good economic message. So that would be an instance where that message would absolutely capture tier 1 economic anxiety. The question is, and I think you know this, do they articulate it? That'll be the question. But that was very well said. Very well said.
Okay, Brian, do you have anything to add?
One thing I'll add about tariffs, part of the reason that question is big, like that is absolutely the issue affecting farmers and market access is true, and the question of like, will candidates be able to articulate it is exactly right. Part of the reason that both those things are true is because tariff politics are complicated. Democrats had for a long time had a concern about free trade. Republicans had the other position. Trump sort of saw there was an issue there, capitalized on it. Why is it like that both parties have sort of been for and against all this stuff at the same time? It's because of the way that it affects people's lives when you come, and farmers are a good example. So farmers, when trade disputes spin out of control, they lose market access, they can't sell their crops. That is true. It's also true that having wide open market access with unfair trade deals that were ripping off the country also weren't helping. And that's something that, Sherrod Brown in Ohio was talking about on the Democratic side before Donald Trump was talking about on the Republican side. And so you've got farmers who say, we got to get tougher. We got to have harder negotiations. If you got to use a tariff to knock China around a little bit, let's do it. They got farmers who will say that, and they will also say, I'm losing my market access. I can't sell my soybeans. I can't, my grain elevator won't take my corn, whatever it is. So both things are true. And it's not that farmers are, bipolar on this issue. It's that they live with the reality that trade deals that weren't negotiated in a way that put family farms first has depressed prices and wiped out farms. And it is also true that trade disputes that are trying to, remedy those issues, if they go too far, that will also wipe out farmers. So it's a very difficult double-edged sword to get that policy right.
Okay, so Katrina, don't take this personally, but I have to bring up Derek Van Orden in the 3rd Congressional District. And Trump isn't on the ballot in 2026, but Van Orden is. Mm-hmm. So there is this thing about Republican voters not necessarily voting so strongly when Trump's not on the ballot. So is Van Orden headed for defeat because of the circumstances, or is he going to survive?
I don't take this personally at all. I love talking about Derek Van Orden. I wish he would debate because he is his own worst enemy. So I think both are true. I think, number one, that I've looked at, especially in my neck of the woods, Portage, Wood County, we had many, many Obama towns and rural villages that went to Trump multiple times and will go back to, or vote back and forth between Democrats and Republicans if you show up. And I know because I outperformed at the top of the ticket multiple elections by talking to those voters and having real conversations with them. I think what Derek Van Orden is counting on is that if he associates himself enough with Trump, he will turn out those Trump voters. But ask Republicans how many people came out last year in 2024 to vote for just Trump, and they didn't vote all the way down the ticket. And it's even harder in a midterm when your incumbent candidate is on Twitter what appears to be 20 hours a day, insulting his own constituents and doxing them. And so I think that is going to be, not only is it, numerically in terms of polling one of the most competitive districts in the country, but Derek hasn't shown, Congressman Van Orden hasn't shown that he can deliver for his constituents. He's more focused on partisan fighting. And that is not what rural voters in western and central Wisconsin want. They actually want someone who can deliver results. So I think some other candidates who associate themselves with Trump might be able to turn out independent, rural, moderate voters. I don't think Van Orden is one of them. I think he's gone after the next year.
Okay, so Charles, what are you seeing in the third or in your other data that might hint at what's to happen in the year that Trump is not on the ballot?
Yeah, well, I think the turnout point is absolutely right, that we see in our data that, you know, if you go back to 2000 or the 2000s, high turnout favored Democrats, low turnout favored Republicans. But that has really changed over this last 25 years, and a midterm election, especially in Wisconsin, because we do turn out at the second or third highest level in the country, sometimes the highest level in the country, means that our midterms are still pretty high turnout relative to a lot of states where midterms drop off even more. You see the biggest advantage in the spring elections where turnout is the lowest, and that's where that Democratic turnout advantage has really helped. So I do think that the midterm will be a bit of an advantage to Democrats relative to Republicans, but I wouldn't think of it as the magic bullet that gives any confidence about who's going to win. Candidates do still matter, and how Van Orden or any member of Congress addresses their district and the issues within their district, and at least as importantly, how their challenger addresses those issues is still a huge part of it. And so I don't have any crystal ball of the outcome there. I do think that the normal midterm advantage to the out party is certainly true, but I think the turnout advantage is a bit of an addition to that. But to reinforce one point, simply running against Donald Trump is not, in our data at least, a very convincing strategy. I hear a lot on social media about disappointed Trump voters or regretful Trump voters. Well, sorry, folks. Among Trump voters in our surveys, 92% approve of the job he's doing. That doesn't look anything like a big wholesale regret. And when you live in the Democratic cocoon, where literally in our data in Wisconsin, 97% of Democrats disapprove of the job Trump's doing, it's awfully easy for Democrats to convince themselves that what they hear from other Democrats is what they can sell to independents and those mythical, reluctant, or regretful Trump voters. And I think that messaging element is a huge problem when within your party there's virtual unanimity, but you need to still communicate with folks that aren't in the party.
All right, now it's question time from the audience. Somebody has emailed me a question. I think I'll read it. Everyone agrees economic anxiety is a major political factor for rural voters. Economic anxiety is also high in the inner city areas and among younger voters. Why or how does that anxiety in rural areas translate into more conservative voters compared to other voting groups facing that anxiety? Yeah, is it more acute? Does it have more power, that negative, in rural areas?
I'll take a stab at
that.
Yeah. I think the answer is urban voters are like homogenous. They pretty much just vote block. I mean, I think history shows that the urban core is what it is, and I think you made the point earlier, the turnout number is really what drives the ultimate margin. So I think it's almost like a cultural behavior pattern. I am in a city and I vote Dem. I mean, that's my take. And by the way, they'll do it cycle after cycle. The only thing you'll see is different demographics within that turnout base that just will maybe not show up. They're not going to come vote for my guy, but they may not show up.
I've got another thought on that, too. I think that I'll let other people evaluate what policies are and are not working in urban areas and whether it points to Republican or Democratic solutions. But the economic angst in urban areas has been spoken about for a long time. I'm not saying it's been addressed. I'm not saying that rural voters have a more rightful claim to economic angst than urban voters. Absolutely not. I mean, if you're in the inner city, there are places in the Northwoods in this state, and there are places in the American South where a lot of voters who are conservative have a lot in common with inner city voters, and could including economic things in the way that drugs and all these things affected these communities. So urban voters have an absolutely legitimate claim to the economic angst question as well. But that has been spoken to for a while. Whether it has been getting solved effectively or not is an additional debate, but it's been spoken to for a while. The rural economic angst has been, going on for more than a century, and for a long time really wasn't recognized.
I would agree that speaking to those concerns is incredibly important, and that's why Rust Belt Rising focuses so much on that economic anxiety, because so many people in rural communities haven't heard that acknowledgement and validation from Democratic candidates that rural areas are struggling and rural voters and people are important. I think also when you have, I mentioned earlier, the decline of institutions like, public schools in your neighborhood and 2-year campuses or 4-year campuses. I'm thinking about, I grew up in rural Shawano County. It was a town of 1,000, 30 minutes from Anago, Wausau, and Shawano. And, the DMV was open for 4 hours once a month. If you needed to go to the dentist, doctor, orthodontist, optometrist, any kind of specialist, there were certain hours where, you could always tell kids with braces, everyone left at the same time for a 4-hour period, right? They all come back with McDonald's, because of the new McDonald's on the corner in Wittenberg, new thing for us. But that's the kind of place where if you lose one of those places, whether it's the community center that hosts the American Legion auxiliary meetings I used to go to, or your local bowling alley, that's the place where everyone goes to celebrate their birthdays, that loss is cultural too. It isn't just economic. And so if you're a 5th generation rural Portage County farmer, Polish Catholic, grew up, your parents and your grandparents live down the road from you, you still go to the local Catholic church, and are super proud of your dairy farming heritage, but all of a sudden the dairy farm goes away, what does that mean? That cultural loss in addition to the economic one. And I think that's been unspoken for so long. I think people like Brian are elevating that nationally, and it's really exciting that rural voters are finally being seen. But I think they felt a lack of respect for so long, and they've felt, ignored. And I think that is new, that there are so many books and research being done by folks who are elevating those voices.
Isn't it kind of ironic that the real estate guy from Queens is the one to voice these feelings, though? I mean, Katrina, what about that?
Well,
he doesn't seem to be the if I had to draw, the archetype of the spokesman for rural America.
Yeah, well, look at how Barack Obama did in rural counties and towns, too. I would have never expected, I think sometimes it really depends on the messenger matters, right? And I think that he had a pivotal message at a time when there was no hope, right? And so I'm thinking back to that because that was my first time voting in a presidential election, and I looked at all the election results in central Wisconsin. You mentioned Charles Dave Obey. He served, 42 years, and widely revered across all of north central Wisconsin, a very Republican area now. The man delivered. As a congressman and chair of the Appropriations Committee, there are buildings all over northern and central Wisconsin because of him. And so I think there's a piece of this there's personality driven. I argued about Obama, being one of those archetypes as well. But there's also trust. Every politician says they're going to do things. How many actually deliver? And if you're somebody like former Congressman Dave Obey, who has delivered over and over medical buildings, research, dental centers for rural people who are high poverty and super low sparse communities, that makes a massive difference. So I would argue it's multiple things. There's a personality component to this, the messenger matters too, but I think beyond that, for long-term voter behavior, it's can the candidate deliver? And, I think people are seeing a rural-urban connection here with lack of investment. And I mentioned the corporate consolidation changing, small towns when things shut down. The same is true of urban communities. There are food deserts, right? There are healthcare deserts. There are news deserts across rural and in some urban communities. And I think that more people are organizing to show that the intersection of those two things being true, in the same way that, you can be in Portage County and not be able to drink water from your private well at the same time that someone in Milwaukee can't, is trying to get their lateral replaced. So there's a lot of connections, and I think smart politicians understand there's more that unites us than divides us.
Ryan, you were going to say something when I mentioned.
I don't remember what the question was.
Well, it was, what I said was the irony that Trump, the real estate guy from Queens, becomes the spokesman for.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was because I've moderated so many focus groups, and it is so consistent regardless of what part of the country you're in. Why are you voting for Donald Trump? He tells it like it is. I mean, that's literally the verbatim I always get. And then when I go, yeah, as a researcher, I'm trying to probe, get a little bit deeper, and I'll say, yeah, but this guy's got like gold-plated toilets and private jets, brother. I mean, what are you talking about? I wish I had that. and I make it an issue of connection on that point because we cannot appropriately, ingest and digest and understand the analysis of Donald Trump without understanding that fundamentally people hate politicians in this country. They see an authenticity with Donald Trump. Whether you like it or not, they do. Enough people do. Let's say enough people do. And I think that's why I say he can get, I don't want to say he gets away with it because that sounds negative, but that's why he can be that way, in my opinion.
Okay, here, Jimmy.
Yeah, thank you for this discussion. It's really enlightening. We got an open governor's seat coming up in Wisconsin, and the candidates are piling up on both sides. It's going to be a wild race. The whole template for how to run for governor or how to run for any office has been kind of blown up. Do you see, I'm not going to ask you to predict who's going to be the Democrat and the Republican selection, but in the primary, do you think the candidate that advances is going to be one that goes more towards polarization or is going to run on a platform of bringing people together? Do people even care anymore? They're like, I'm going to vote for inflation and economy. I don't care if they're coming together.
Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, let Charles do that one.
All right, Charles.
Thank you.
I didn't know we could hand questions to people. That's good.
I'm watching to see whether we talk about state issues or focus on Trump and the national issues. I think there'll be a strong urge in both parties to nationalize. That unity within Democrats that I was talking about earlier makes it awfully hard for a Democrat not to bash Trump a lot. And on the Republican side, tying yourself to Donald Trump is, getting that endorsement in a Republican primary matters a lot. So I think those are the forces that will pull both parties to national issues. But I'd remind you of fix the damn roads. It is possible for us to have state issues be an important element of the governor's race. And I think that will be a question for me is, does that emerge, or do we end up really just fighting the primaries on fealty or opposition and then fighting the general on this nationalized race, and you take your chances with it? Or do you try to tailor a message to issues that are specific to the state? And I certainly don't know which you will do, but I'm watching.
Okay, so here's a question from an audience member. Why does southwestern Wisconsin vote differently, meaning less conservative, than other rural areas up north, for example? Like Sauk County is now a swing district. So a swing county. Go ahead, Brian.
I guess I have to take a whack at that one. I think that some of it is some migration patterns more recently, right? So Sauk County, there's a lot of people moving over the border from Dane County to Sauk County for the lower taxes and the nice, more affordable property near the river and stuff like that. So some of it is migration. But in southwest Wisconsin, I think northern Wisconsin had agriculture, but also had logging and all kinds of other things that made the economy up there a little bit different. In southwest Wisconsin, there was a long history of blue-collar Democrats connecting in a way that Dave Obey kind of did, blue-collar Democrats connecting their policies with the lives of folks in southwest Wisconsin. And there were a lot of people voting blue-collar, but they were voting for blue-collar Democrats as well as Republicans. That happened for a long time. In northern Wisconsin, Obey was kind of the only one doing that in a big way, and when he went, it all just kind of flipped. In southwest Wisconsin, you still had a mix of that. And, I grew up in an area where Howard Markline and Todd Novak are continually getting elected when Democrats feel they should be able to beat them. But then on the other direction, Dave Considine was consistently getting elected as a Democrat when Republicans thought they should be able to beat him. And so I think it's that mix And a lot of it, I think, goes back to the deep agricultural roots where there was a tie. There was a tie between policy and farm country on the Democratic side, whether Republicans liked it or not. And so it's a little bit more mixed.
Okay, other questions? Oh, come on, I'm going to have to call on somebody like Mark Eisen. Oh, wait, where? Oh, up here, okay. Coming your way.
Hi, going back to the rural issue, I know a lot of the polls that's always registered voters, but I have a kind of two-part question, I guess, for the data people up there, or if you want to give your own opinion. Number one, is the registration rate like the same as urban, higher? And then is, for the registered voters, is the show up to elections higher or the same as, you know, what you'd expect? Just curious as to participation.
Yeah, I think we have, first of all, high registration rates throughout the state. There's not gigantic urban-rural differences in registration. The turnout thing is much more closely tied to Donald Trump and his ability to mobilize the so-called low-propensity voters that was apparent in 2016 and 20 and 24. And it drops off outside of those. So that's where there's more of a difference, and it means that those rural parts of the state that are heavy for Trump, but where he's also successfully mobilized people in his elections, risk more of a drop-off. I would also come back to one other thing, which is, I mentioned earlier that if you look at our demographic data, we vote a little less Republican, including in rural areas, than you would expect for those demographics. That actually is a suggestion that there is still room for movement in a more Republican direction if our demographic voting patterns moved into a little more alignment with the rest of the country. So I don't know how that will change, but earlier we were talking about whether Trump had maxed out in the rural parts of the state. And before the 24 election, I was citing this data as a reason to think there was still room for some further upward movement and not to think of it being maxed out yet.
You know, we took a national precinct map compared, or county, and compared to 2016, the margins. You know, the interesting correlation is the closer the rural area is to the southern border, the higher it went to Trump.
Yes.
So that's why when you get way out here, like where we're at right now, the immigration issue is not the thing that it is there. It is very interesting to see that correlation graphically when you look at it that way.
So
I would also add, I'm sorry, I have to say one thing. You have more people on your voter file than the census says you have people here, so it's really hard to know turnout. It's really hard to understand registration. And you also do same day.
We do same day. That's about 10%. And,
That's a lot in a tight state,
yeah,
isn't it?
No, it
That's a
absolutely
lot.
is. It absolutely is. Now, in fairness, some of that is people changing and updating their registration rather than their first registration. Also, the complication is, and especially for some of the national voter files that we use, is we include people on the voter file who are marked as inactive. Those folks are not active voters, but unless you're really careful about how you filter them out, I'm sure you are, but a lot of journalists and others are less scrupulous about that. It is the case that when you look at the active voter file, that's pretty good. But what's your turnout rate? Is it the number of people that were registered before Election Day in December 1st, or it takes time to update? What about January 1st? So yeah.
And I would argue as a pollster with 10% same-day reg,
yeah.
that's a game changer in a state that's...
Well, welcome to my life here.
Yeah, it's like, so it's not fair. You know, you get a guy that's like, yeah, this guy's up 3 points. You have that many people same-day reg, and that's not right.
So Ryan, haven't the Republicans been winning the registration war of late?
I would say yes, because we're finally investing in it at a very substantial level. I'll tell you anecdotally, the way that I met Susie Wiles, White House Chief of Staff, we were working a race in Florida, and the culture of Susie Wiles' view on politics is voter reg. It just goes all the way back to how she ran her politics when she was young. So I think that she brought that mindset to the front and forefront of Trump world because she saw it was a problem in 20 Obviously, there was a lot of challenges to doing voter reg in 20. But that was something that she immediately identified, and as the head of that political organization, I think that's part of the reason why it's gotten so much better. But again, these things are cyclical, so we'll see.
Thanks, Jeff. I ran races before '04. Social issues were guns and abortion. That was it. Social media, everything else since then. How much do social issues and rural voters tie to the personality of the candidate? Because Obama, Hillary, Harris, Trump, they've never bailed hay. But voters do connect with them. What are they connecting with them other than policy? Because I don't believe it's always policy. Is it social issues that are driving some of their behavior? And is it reinforcing some of what they already thought?
I don't think it's one answer. I mean, I'm glad you brought up '04, because remember, Karl Rove intentionally put DOMA on statewide ballots all over the country because Massachusetts had just legalized gay marriage. So I would argue maybe in '04 that helped with turnout. That wouldn't help today. I don't think it would. But I'm not going to say, when you say social issues, I mean, if it's all about like trans and things like that, yeah, that could probably animate certain parts of the country, rural voters. I think they're not, every part of the country is going to be different on social issues though. Like the more you get out of Salt Lake City in Utah, oh boy, that's real Mormon, right? And when you get into Colorado, I would argue it's a little bit more of a libertarian mindset when you get outside of Boulder and Denver. Denver's a rough place these days, right? So, but I think there's not one thing, but I know y'all are tired of hearing us talking about economic anxiety. I wouldn't lean in on social issues this cycle and with rural voters unless I saw evidence that it was working. I don't know if you have a different perspective.
No, I think that's right, but the layer that I would add to it is, I think that, you saw President Obama have an issue around that when he accused rural America of clinging to guns and religion. That was like kind of a moment where he actually had kind of a decent stumble there, right? And so the way I look at it is, here's what economic anxiety and some of those cultural issues you talked about have in common, whatever people think about the individual policy on that. If it feels like it's being taken away, that's a frustration. So the economic status quo right now has led to an economic decline for decades in rural America. If they think that you're coming to take away their guns or whatever else the issue is, or if you don't respect their religious beliefs, there's kind of a little bit of a live and let live attitude that I've encountered a lot in rural areas, where it's kind of like, you can think what you think, I think what I think, but if you think what I think is a problem, now we have a problem. And so I think that's where social issues fit into the picture today, is if people feel like their economic situation isn't getting addressed, if they think that the way they want to live their lives is somehow under threat, that's the way I see that getting more animated and getting pulled in.
I agree with that, and I was going to mention, I think the role of government and each individual's belief in the role of government for that time in history, right? I argued earlier, Obama, there was such an I think the endless war component was huge at that time, right? And in the same way that Trump coming on the scene in 2016 was extremely anti-establishment, extremely anti-loyal, the reverse of loyal to institutions, big and small, media. Especially, he used Hollywood as a great trope of a scapegoat, right? He, global affairs, NATO is a great example. I mean, he's so anti-institution in every way, and I think voters saw that as authentic, and rural voters especially were like, well, we don't have any institutions in our community. Those haven't been serving us. They've only been to the, and then list the culture war issue, the ads they see or whatever. I would say strong candidates who are running as Democrats are going to spend less time on the issues that the Democratic base is talking about and more time on the issues that literally everyone cares about, which is the pocketbook issue, right? And I think that, going back to that question about primaries, I think that I've seen over the last decade in Wisconsin, more Democratic primary voters are actually keenly aware of, game theory and if we elect this candidate how will they, maybe they don't want a politician because then they'll lose because people don't like politics, right? So there's different strategies, and people will say, well, this person was my second choice, but I think they'll actually win the general. Or, I think there's a component to this that is being underestimated, and I think if you're a rural voter, you're going to look at, people not party. I've heard that probably 10,000 times over 12 years. And that person matters, not just the personality, but also, is it a midterm? Is it not? What are they saying? How are they dressing? Are they wearing loafers to a farm tour? And all of that stuff matters. And it all adds up, right? Your personal story. Are you from here? Where were you born and raised? Do you have a Wisconsin accent, right? So all of those things matter in this race, and I think candidates who won and lost would agree with some of those things because, we've seen candidates without Wisconsin accents fly in, try to win, lose, fly out. And at the same time, we've seen candidates wear loafers to farm tours and lose. So, I think we can all learn from that, and I think probably the key takeaway today is that no voter is going to be the same as another voter, and they're all going to weigh policy versus personality versus what is urgent for them, right? What is urgent for them, and what are we offering as candidates, as parties? And, it's on both parties to really work on that delivering component and trust.
Okay, tip of the day to the candidates, don't wear your loafers to the farm tour. Okay, I think everybody gets that one. All right.
Are you saying I wouldn't be a good candidate here?
Yeah, you got to work on your Wisconsin accent too, Ryan. I'm saying. All right, I think this is a good place to close, and then people can mingle a little bit afterwards. I want to thank our sponsors, of course, Platform Communications, Spectrum, Wisconsin Counties Associations, Michael Best Strategies, ARP Wisconsin, and thanks to our panel. Let's hear it for them. Thanks, everybody, for attending and viewing, and we'll get you a copy of the slides. And if you have any comments, you can always talk to me. See you later.
You have been watching a production of Wisconsin Eye, your unfiltered window into legislative deliberations and public policy programming, where our mission is to provide Wisconsinites an opportunity to access the legislative process and connect with conversations that inform our citizenry. Please consider supporting our mission, and thank you for watching. Wisconsin Eye, policy made public.